There is a sound in the memory of the jungle that does not belong to the rain or the canopy or the call of a distant bird. It is a mechanical sound, a low, rhythmic, hammering grunt that echoes not in the ears, but in the chest. It is the sound of a machine that was too heavy, too clumsy, and too hungry for the war it was sent to fight. They called it the pig, and it was the sound of American survival. In the early days of the conflict, the forces of the North Vietnamese army, veterans of a war that had never truly ended, possessed a quiet confidence. They moved through their world, the world of triple canopy jungle and winding, muddy trails, with an economy of motion. Their rifles, the rock-solid AK-47, and their light machine guns, the dependable RPD, were extensions of their philosophy. They were rugged, simple, and they worked. They worked in the monsoon rain, they worked in the sucking mud. They worked after being buried in the red earth. They were the tools of a ghost army, and then the Americans came with their thunder. They brought the sky down with helicopters, they brought fire from the clouds, and on the ground, they brought a new kind of weapon. It was long, dark, and impossibly heavy. The M60 general-purpose machine gun. To the NVA observer, watching from a spider hole or a bamboo thicket, it must have seemed like a joke. It was a caricature of American excess. It weighed over 23 pounds, unloaded. Its ammunition, the powerful 62mm round, came in belts that snagged on every thorn and vine. It required a team of men, a gunner and an assistant gunner, to feed it, to carry its spare barrel, to manage its violent appetite. The NVA soldier, with his chest pouch of light magazines, moved like the jungle wind. The American gunner, humping the pig, and 500 rounds of ammunition, moved like a man drowning in a sea of green. They mocked it. In the quiet moments before the ambushes, they would listen to the crashing and swearing of the American patrols, weighed down by this absurd anchor. The M60, they called it, using the American designation. It was a tool of a conventional army trying to fight an unconventional war. It was a machine designed for the fields of Europe, now suffocating in the humidity of Southeast Asia. They believed it would fail. They believed the mud and the rain would claim it. They were, for a time, correct. The gun was prone to failure. Its moving parts were complex, its temperament fickle. In the hands of a green recruit, it was a 23-pound club. The early models had flaws, components that would snap or shear. The jungle did its best to swallow it whole. The NVA, patient and methodical, exploited this. They let the Americans grow tired, frustrated, and overconfident in their firepower, and then they struck from the shadows, where the heavy gun could not be brought to bear. But they had misunderstood the nature of the weapon, and they had, more importantly, misunderstood the men who were forced to carry it. The M60 was not a rifle. It was a covenant. It was a promise made by one 19-year-old to the rest of his squad, a promise that he would carry this impossible burden, this cross of steel, so that they might live. The gunner was not just a soldier. He was the anchor. He was the base of fire. He was the man who would stand his ground when every instinct screamed to run. The sound of the M60 was its first true weapon. The AK-47 had a sharp, frantic chatter. The M16 had a high-pitched, rapid crack. The M60 had a thump, a deep, deliberate thud, thud, thud that punched through the air at around 550 rounds per minute. It wasn't the terrifying, fabric-ripping shriek of the German MG-42 from a war before. It was slower, more methodical. It was the sound of a giant, angry heart. If you were there, you'd never forget that sound. It was the sound that cut through the chaos, the one rhythm you could find in the middle of a firefight. The transformation began not in the grand strategy rooms, but in the small, desperate actions that defined the war. It began with the men. The GIs, with their relentless, desperate ingenuity, learned the pig's personality. They learned its moods, its weaknesses, its hunger. They learned to clean it with religious devotion. They learned to hold the belt just so, to prevent the feed from jamming. They learned to swap a glowing hot barrel in under 10 seconds, their hands covered in asbestos mitts, the smell of searing metal and oil filling the air. They learned to carry it. They carried it through rice paddies where the water was chest deep, and the mud was a living thing, trying to pull them under. They carried it up razor-backed ridges, where the heat was so intense it shimmered on the gun's black surfaces. The sling would dig into a man's shoulder, leaving a permanent, raw mark. The gunner and the assistant gunner, the AG, became a single entity. One man carried the gun, the other carried the spare barrel and the first few belts. They were tethered by the weapon. The AG was the gunner's lifeline, his protector, his armor. He fed the beast, and in return, the beast kept the world at bay. The psychological weight was even heavier. To carry the M60 was to wear a target. In any ambush, the NVA and VC were trained to find the radio operator, the officer, and the machine gunner. The sound of the pig was a beacon. It drew rocket-propelled grenades. It drew mortar fire. It drew a concentration of AK-47s. The life expectancy of a machine gunner in a hot landing zone was measured in seconds. Yet for every gunner who fell, another man would drop his rifle and crawl through the mud to grab the pig. He would pull it from the grasp of his fallen brother, sling the ammo belts over his own neck, and open fire. The gun could not be allowed to go silent. The mockery stopped the first time a confident NVA unit launched a human wave assault against a line of tired, entrenched GIs. They saw the clumsy weapon, and they believed their numbers and their fighting spirit would carry the day. They came on, through the wire, through the mortar fire, their battle cries mixing with the sharp reports of their rifles. And then the pigs opened up. This is where the technical specifications become a kind of terrible music. The M60 fired the 7.62 twice, 51mm NATO round. It was a heavy, powerful cartridge, designed to be effective out to 1,000 meters and beyond. In the close quarters battles of the jungle, this range was irrelevant. What mattered was its power. What mattered was what it did to the jungle itself. The 5.50 6-meter round of the M16 was light and fast. It was easily deflected. A bamboo stalk, a thick leaf, a rotted log, all could send the small bullet tumbling off course. The NVA knew this. They built their bunkers and fighting positions to withstand it. They fought from behind earthen berms and curtains of dense foliage, invisible and protected. The M60 did not care. When the gunner squeezed the butterfly trigger, he was not firing bullets. He was releasing a storm. The heavy 7.62mm rounds tore through the jungle. They didn't just hit the leaves, they shredded them. They turned bamboo thickets into green mulch. They ripped through the packed earth defenses. A round from the M60 would pass through a small tree and kill the man hiding behind it. It didn't just wound, it dismembered. It was a force of pure, kinetic violence. The NVA soldiers, who had advanced with such confidence, were now facing a machine that was mowing down the very world around them. The jungle, their ally, their camouflage, their fortress, was being erased. The sound, that thump, 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 was no longer a clumsy grunt. It was a judgment. It was the sound of a mechanical dragon breathing a stream of invisible hypersonic steel. This was the moment the legend of the pig was born. It was the great equalizer. A single gunner, well positioned, could hold off a company. He could break the back of an assault. He became the pivot point of American tactics. The riflemen did not attack. They moved under the cover of the M60. The phrase was base of fire. The M60 was the base, the foundation, the rock upon which the entire squad's survival was built. They developed tactics born of this new respect. The mad minute, where at dusk all heavy weapons would fire into the perimeter, sending a wall of lead into the encroaching darkness, just to let the unseen enemy know they were ready. The M60 was the lead instrument in that orchestra. They learned to walk the fire. A gunner, a man of impossible strength and courage, would stand up, hold the M60 at his hip, a feat that should have been impossible, the recoil strong enough to break a man's balance, and walk forward, firing long, sweeping bursts. He would walk into the enemy fire, guiding his squad by the sheer volume of his own. It was a terrifying, almost suicidal act of faith. Faith in the machine and faith in the men behind him. The NVA learned to fear it. They learned to listen for it. The sound of a Huey helicopter was the sound of mobility. The sound of a Phantom jet was the sound of napalm. But the sound of the M60 was immediate. It was personal. It meant that a handful of American infantrymen who should have been cut off and surrounded were not only fighting back, they were winning. They were holding the line. The pig was what gave them the time to call in the thunder. The gunners became legends within their own platoons. They were often the biggest men, but not always. Sometimes they were the quietest, the ones who understood the responsibility. They carried the ammo in linked belts, often wrapped around their own bodies, a steel bandolier that made them look like warlords of some industrial fallen age. They had a dark sense of humor. They named their guns Puff, the bitch, Satan's sledgehammer. They loved and hated the weapon in equal measure. They hated its weight. They hated its complexity. They hated the way it would jam at the worst possible moment. A round slipping off the feed tray, a failure to extract, the dreaded runaway gun where the sear would wear out and the gun would not stop firing until the belt was empty. They hated the burns on their hands from the barrel changes, the permanent ringing in their ears, the ache in their shoulders that never, ever went away. But they loved what it did. They loved the feeling of control when the world dissolved into noise and panic. They loved the solid, reassuring thunk as the bolt chambered a new round. They loved the power that flowed through their hands, the ability to draw a line in the dirt and say, "You will not cross." They loved the way it made the riflemen around them feel safe. The sound of the pig was the sound of Daddy being home. Comment: I remember the pig, if that sound, even in memory, still means power. The mockery from the NVA dissolved into a quiet, lethal respect. They began to specifically hunt the M60. They would send sappers and snipers to take out the gunner, knowing that if the pig went silent, the entire American position was vulnerable. The duels that unfolded in the jungle were biblical. It was the patient, single shot of the N-Posen Nagant sniper rifle against the overwhelming, rhythmic roar of the M60. In one engagement, a long-range reconnaissance patrol, a small 6-man team, was compromised and surrounded by a battalion. They were hundreds of miles from help, with only the jungle for cover. The NVA commander, knowing he had them, offered a chance to surrender. The answer came from the team's M60 gunner. He set his gun up on a small rise, his AG feeding him the last of their ammunition, and began to fire. He fired in controlled 3-second bursts. Thump, thump, thump. Pause. Thump, thump, thump. Pause. He was not firing at random. He was firing at the sound of the enemy's command. at the rustle of their movement. He held off 2 full assaults. The NVA, shocked at the volume of fire, believed they were facing a much larger force. The gunner and his team used that hesitation to slip away, melting back into the jungle, leaving behind only a pile of smoking brass cartridges and a stunned enemy. The gun was not a perfect weapon. It was a compromise. It was heavy because its barrel needed to be thick to absorb the heat. It was complex because it was trying to do the job of both a heavy machine gun and a light machine gun. It was a general-purpose weapon, and in the specific brutal environment of Vietnam, general purpose often meant not quite right. But war is not won by perfect weapons. It is fought by imperfect men. And the M60 was a very human machine. It was flawed. It was difficult. It was often maddening. But in the right hands, in the hands of a man who understood it, who had bonded with it through miles of mud and hours of terror, it was a masterpiece of defiance. It was a blunt, brutal instrument, but it was their instrument. When the war ended and the veterans came home, they left the guns behind. But the gun never left them. The M60 became a symbol, an icon. It appeared in movies, in photographs, always in the hands of the story's grizzled, unbreakable hero. But the reality was more profound. The men who humped the pig in the jungles of Vietnam were not heroes from a movie. They were boys. They were 19, 20 years old. They were mechanics, farmers, and students, drafted and thrown into a world they could not comprehend. The M60 was the single heaviest burden they would ever be asked to carry. And they carried it. They carried it for their squad mates, for the man on their left and the man on their right. The mockery of the NVA was the sound of hubris. The eventual silence of that mockery was the sound of a hard-won, bloody respect. They learned that the gun was not the threat. The threat was the man behind it. The threat was the American GI's terrifying, stubborn refusal to be broken. The threat was the loyalty that would make a man stand up in a firefight, the jungle exploding around him, to change a hot barrel or to unjam a feed tray. Also, his brothers could move. The M60 is retired now, replaced by lighter, more reliable, more lethal machines. The M240, the M249, they are, by all accounts, better weapons. But they do not have the same soul. They do not have the same story. The story of the M60 is not about the 7.62mm round, or the quick change barrel, or the 550 rounds per minute. It is about the weight, the physical weight on the shoulder, and the psychological weight on the heart. It is the story of the men who were strong enough to bear both. The jungle holds on to its memories. The echoes of the B-52 strikes and the artillery barrages have faded. The trails have been reclaimed. But somewhere, in the memory of the red earth and the humid air, that sound remains. It is not the crack of a rifle or the boom of a mortar. It is a deep, pounding rhythm. It is the sound of a machine that grunted, that complained, that failed, and that, in the end, held the line. It is the sound of the pig. It is the sound of the courage it took to feed it. If this story moved you, write below. We never forget.